Hello and welcome to episode 270. It's a pleasure today to be joined by Jason De Leon. Jason is director of the Cotsen Institute of Archaeology, the Endowed Chair of Archaeology, and professor of Anthropology and Chicano-Chicana Studies, Chicano Study and Central American Studies at UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles. He's executive director of the Undocumented Migration Project, which is known as UMP. It's a research, arts, and education collective that seeks to raise awareness about migration issues globally. He is the author of two award-winning books. The first was The Land of Open Graves, Living and Dying on the Migrant Trail, which featured photos by Michael Wells, and Soldiers and Kings, which is the 2024 National Book Award winner for nonfiction. The full title of the book is Soldiers and Kings, Survival and Hope in the World of Human Smuggling. He is also the 2017 MacArthur Foundation Fellow. In addition to his scholarly pursuits, he's an active musician who sang and played guitar with the Long Beach-based hardcore punk reggae band Youth in Asia in the mid to late 1990s, and the Americana band the Wilcox Hotel based out of State College, Pennsylvania, between 2005 and 2008. He currently plays bass in the War Pigs and is involved in various musical projects, including periodic reunions with the Wilcox Hotel. Woo! You do a lot.
It seems like it when you say it like that. Yeah.
This
It made me tired just thinking about it.
is a silly question. War Pigs, Ozzy Osbourne?
Yeah, it's with my 8-year-old and my 11-year-old who
Nice.
at the time that the band was formed were huge Sabbath fans.
Black Sabbath,
Um,
right, right,
yeah,
right,
it's funny. They've kind of moved away from Black Sabbath, but we're sort of stuck with
right.
we're kind of stuck with the
Dang it.
name.
Dang it. Well, good afternoon. Awesome to talk to you. Honored to talk to you. And again, congratulations on the National Book Award. Obviously, incredibly well deserved. And we'll talk about all the years and all the research you put into it. Um, I the book is incredible. It's like I said, such a pleasure to talk to you. But when I saw your Instagram handle, I almost had to cancel the interview.
Yeah, I bet. Yeah.
Okay, I'm a Kings fan. I'm a huge Kings fan.
Uh,
Okay, so when your handle is what? Roberto Ori?
yeah, so
Like Big Game Bob, right? Big Game
yeah,
Rob?
I mean, I wish that guy was my dad. I mean, he's like you know, he
Mm.
many people dislike that guy because you don't want to give him the basketball with five
No,
seconds left. It's
no,
really,
no.
but one of my favorite things I heard him say was after that game, um, which if you look at my Instagram handle, it used to be Roberto Harry, Harry, and
Ah.
now it's Roberto Hori, just to people get a better sense. But if you, the reason that it's called that is because I had someone, um, go to Mexico once and asked me if I wanted a souvenir, and this person's mom lived in San Miguel de Allende, where they make a
Ah.
lot of these paintings of these these milagros. And she said,
Ah.
"Is there something that you would like?" And I said, "You know what? Could you?" I gave her a picture of Robert Ory shooting over Chris Webber, and I said,
Oh no.
"Could you get someone to paint this for me as like a miracle?" And she said she went and got the guy to do it, and the guy was like, "Are you sure he thinks this is a miracle?" And she was like, "He definitely he is a firm believer."
Wow.
So she came
Oh.
back with this oil painting that's it's in one of my one of my photos on Instagram of this moment with like the saint in the crowd sort of helping, but underneath
Mm.
it says Roberto Harry, Harry, in Spanish is winning this
Ah.
game against Los Reyes del Sacramento. Um,
Oh my
but
God.
just, I mean, such a like, I mean, heartbreaking thing if you're a Kings
Yeah,
fan, and just like
yes,
this
yes, yes.
this life affirming thing if you're a Lakers fan. But the thing I always appreciated about Robert Ory is after that game, Vlade Divac in the press conference says, "Oh, that's just very lucky," and
Mm.
and Ori says, "It's not luck. I've been doing that my whole career. Like
Ooh.
I've got a lot of rings. I've got
Yes.
more rings than Michael Jordan because of,
Uh,
because of this thing." But and then someone said, "Is it really hard to make those kind of shots?" And Robert Ory's response was, he says, "I have a daughter with special needs who is, it's really hard every day to get up and to be a good dad and to be positive and try to support. He's like, it's just it's he's
Mm,
like, that's the real challenge that I have is just
yeah.
trying to be the best dad that I can for my daughter. He's like, this other stuff is just basketball. It's just work. I'm
Uh,
happy for it, but the real work that I do every day is trying to be a good parent. And I always really
Ooh.
appreciated that from him.
Gosh darn it, now you made me a Robert Horry fan.
I know I mean, it's, and then he went to the Spurs and I was like,
Yeah,
oh,
that's right.
and
That's
then I was
right.
mad, but I got over it.
Yeah, I mean, Vladi did what you're kind of taught to do. You're taught to, push it out, but not to the middle of the floor, not to big game Bob. And he's going to
No.
make that 10 times, 9 times out of 10, 10 times out of 10.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Oh, that's an
Yeah.
incredible story about the
Um,
painting. I'll have to find it and share it with the people listening. I'll find it on your Instagram. That's so interesting. But yeah, thank you. I'm gonna have bad dreams tonight. I'll probably dream about that picture, about that shot. That's all right. So how does it feel? I mean, you're, I don't know, maybe a month or two out from winning the award, National Book Award. I mean, hate to put words in your mouth, is it surreal? Like, I mean, how does it feel?
yeah, I mean, it was definitely a surreal kind of the whole process. When they announced the long list, um, I had just gotten off a call with my agent about something else. I mean, actually, it was me trying to pitch her a new book,
Mm.
and then I was like making lunch and I had my phone on silent, and it was just all of these messages. Like she had been calling and texting, and I thought, oh my God, what have I've done something bad because she never calls me.
I see.
Um, and so finally I get her back on the phone, and she gets my editor on the phone, and they were just like kind of losing it. And like the National Book Award was not really something that I understood like what it
Mm.
was. I mean, I kind of knew of it. I
Sure.
mean, it wasn't like I was writing this book going, oh man,
Yeah.
you know, someday.
Uh-huh.
And so it took me a minute to realize why they were so excited. And then I got really excited, like, oh, like I'm not even supposed to be here, much less be on this, this kind of list. And so
Mm.
by the time we got to the award ceremony, it was pretty nerve-wracking. And I'm not someone who gets real nervous about this stuff or someone
Uh-huh.
who I think, I've appreciated the accolades, but I always just really want to do the work and work very hard to sort of stay humble.
Mm.
Um, but this thing was like, yeah, a real kind of shock to the system, and
Yeah.
I'm still processing. But I mean, the next couple of days, I had to like ask my wife, like, that really happened, right? This thing, but such an honor, and for me, the most important, kind of part of it was it's not really about me. It's about the fact that this was a book that made people uncomfortable. It was a subject matter that was difficult, and it was about people who aren't supposed to matter.
Mm.
People whose stories aren't supposed to, we're not supposed to care about these folks because they're the bad guys, because they're poor, because, a million reasons to kind of
Mm.
write them off, and they've been written off in a lot of ways. And so for that story or those stories to be recognized on this national stage, that for me was what really feels, super, um, super important and gratifying.
Mm. We were talking about the Instagram handle, social media. I usually do this at the end, but social media ways to contact you, and then definitely people want to buy this book. Any particular bookstores or ways you might recommend?
Yeah, if bookstores I like, Literati in Ann Arbor is
Mm.
a really great bookstore, and I buy a lot of stuff from them, even though I don't live in Michigan anymore. The Village Well bookstore in Culver City, those
All
folks are
right.
really great. Powell's in Portland, another favorite bookstore of mine. And so I think if folks can support indie, they really should. Or just going to the local bookstore and if they don't have the book, asking them if they can
Yeah.
order it. I think anything that we can do right now to support small businesses is important.
Remind me who the publisher is?
Viking.
Viking. Right, right, right. You've had the talk with Jesse Cass and Gustavo Arellano. Is that coming up or that already
That's
happened?
coming up in a couple of weeks. Yeah.
Nice. We have some
Mm.
SoCal listeners. Where's that going to be? What's it all about?
That's at the Culver City Book Festival, which I believe is in 2 weeks. It's Saturday, February 22nd.
That's three heavy hitters right there. There's some great minds, including
Yeah, it's gonna
yourself.
be it's gonna be fun. It's nice to just be in conversation, especially right now, with folks
Yes.
about everything that's kind of going on.
Right, 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 right. I wonder, growing up, I mean, have you always been a reader? Have you always been interested in story? Were you the kid at the library all the time? I wonder you kind of your early relationship with language.
Reading for me was always really important, and I think part of it was because I grew up kind of I spent a lot of time by myself,
Hmm.
and reading was really a form of escapism for me.
Mm.
I was definitely a child of the Pizza Hut reading club, whatever. I always forget what that was called, but you get the gold stars, and then
Yeah,
you
yeah,
can get a personal pan pizza.
yeah.
I was always at the top of that list. Just a voracious reader, um, and that carried on for a long time. It probably, really until I went to graduate school. And then once
Mm.
I started having to do the heavy academic reading, that killed my love of reading.
Oh
I mean,
no, it didn't. It didn't just injure it; it killed it, huh?
I mean, I stopped reading all the things that I loved. I stopped, and
Uh,
I read mostly fiction, and there was a huge break in that when I was a
yeah.
graduate student. Um, And when I had to work on my first book, I was so demoralized because at that point I hated writing and I just
Okay.
didn't want to do it. I struggled to kind of find joy in it. And working on that first book, I told myself, well, if I have to write a book, I need to go back to reading. I need to discover the things that
Mm.
inspired me, and then use those books to get myself into a better headspace to be able to tell stories. And I think I've
Mm.
always been fascinated by stories, telling stories,
Mm.
listening to other people's stories, as an anthropologist.
Hmm.
Um, a lot of the music that I was into for a long time was sort of story driven.
Mm.
And so that stuff has always kind of been there. And
Yeah.
um, I never considered myself a writer, and I don't know if I still, even if I do now, but I think I'm definitely a storyteller.
Right. The early escapism you talk about, are we talking like sci-fi? Are we talking about like, reading about people all over the world to kind of like quote unquote travel while you're reading? Like, how did that escapism take form?
I think it was just being just being any place other than where I was. I think, and so I was trying to think back up to the early books I remember. I mean, like all the like Super Fudge,
Super Fudge,
um,
classic.
Bunnicula. I mean, those were
Mm.
all, like Judy Blume books. Are You
Hmm.
There, God? It's Me, Margaret. All these things were really,
Yeah.
important. I just liked having something else to think about and keep my sort of brain
Uh-huh.
busy. And I think the kind of years I spent living with my father, which were really difficult and kind of brutal years, my only solace was at school. And so I spent
Hmm.
as much time as I could at school. I loved my teachers. I really wanted them to be proud of me. And so
Hmm.
I was just constantly reading stuff. And that really stuck with me in the long run.
Mm. You write about coming from a like we talk about like first generation college, but like Latino and Filipino family. Like, do you? I mean, obviously you speak Spanish. Did you speak Spanish growing up? Did you speak Tagalog? Was non-English part of your life, or was it all English?
I spoke Spanish growing up. So it's funny, like when my parents were married, that was a trilingual household. My dad was bilingual in
Ah,
English and Spanish. My mom speaks some Tagalog, but speaks another dialect called Waray,
okay.
and English. But it was English only really in the home, partly because I think everybody, this was before it was really boutique for your kids to be bilingual, right?
Sure,
Growing up
sure, sure.
like a bilingual Spanish speaker in the 80s was a sign of, poverty, was a
Hmm.
sign of like otherness. And now, of course, we spend thousands of dollars to teach, kids foreign
Right,
languages,
right.
and we understand that having them learn foreign languages is really great for their brain. But so for me growing up, there was a bit of shame about it, and the Spanish really came from all of the years I spent living in South Texas
Mm,
with my grandmother and my aunt who didn't speak any English and who were
mm,
constantly. I mean, they spoke to me in Spanish. I responded to them in English, partly because I was just always very embarrassed by Spanish, and it wasn't really until I started doing fieldwork in Mexico that I got over it, and it just all kind of came flooding out, and it became
mm,
clear that that early exposure to a foreign language is so important.
hmm. Kind of as you in more recent years, it doesn't necessarily have to be recent, but like, I mean, there are obviously a lot of differences, but I do think of like Luis Alberto Urrea, like with some of his work. Gosh, The Devil's Highway,
Devil's Highway. Yeah.
right? I mean, which is just an unbelievable read. There's one that comes to mind, but I mean, some of the titans, some of the people whose shoulders you're kind of standing on, whether it's in the same kind of genre or same subject matter or not, who are some of those writers now or before who really inspired you, challenged you?
Yeah, it's funny. I got asked recently about why it's so important to read nonfiction, and I said, well, I don't really read a lot of nonfiction. I write nonfiction,
Yeah.
and I do read. I mean, I read nonfiction in terms of ethnographic work that I'm interested in, whatever my agent tells me I should be reading that might be of interest. But really, for me, it's always about fiction.
Mm,
Really inspiring the work or writers who kind of blur those genres or who write I think nonfiction in a very poetic way. And I think
mm,
Luis Alberto Rey is a person who writes very poetically about real life. And I've always, those first that kind of border trilogy, by the Lake of Sleeping Children,
mm,
Across the Wire, and The Devil's Highway were all super influential books
mm,
for me when I kind of began this project. Um, but I would say that you know, people like Steinbeck, Hemingway were very important for me early on.
mhm,
Herman Hesse, um, uh, Cormac McCarthy really became
mm.
important to me as a writer working on my first book, especially like Blood Meridian and Cities of the Plain were two kind of crucial texts. People like Jesmyn Ward.
Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
really I love her nonfiction. I love her fiction. I think that she's a really incredible storyteller, and one of the things I think that she has in common with someone like Hemingway and Steinbeck and some of McCarthy's work is that she can paint this really complicated, moving kind of picture with not a lot of words. It's not
Mm,
super flowery prose. It's often pretty direct
yeah.
and succinct, and yet can break your heart. And
Mm,
those are the kind of writers that I think I've always sort of gravitated towards. But definitely like Springsteen,
mm,
Jason Isbell, like Towns Van Zandt, a lot of kind of Americana singer-songwriters who are telling these rich stories in not a lot of prose.
yeah.
I think all those folks will really continue to inspire me. Ernest Gaines, that's another
Okay.
person. Um, there's one of my favorite living writers is a guy named Willie Vlaughton who's out of the Pacific Northwest, who's written his books like Motel Life and
Mm,
Lean on Pete. He's a kind of novelist of the American West who writes these
mm,
kind of deep, dark kind of stories about the downtrodden, and I really appreciate the
mm.
kind of tightness of the prose.
Yeah, John Prine.
Oh yeah, yeah,
I'm embarrassed to say I don't really know much about him. I know his reputation is kind of like the writing about the downtrodden, kind of
yeah,
the
and
quotidian.
and Prine can write a story with not a lot of words,
Mm,
and there's definitely a lot of kinship between him and someone like Jason Isbell,
mm,
who co-produced one of his last records, and
yeah.
they'd kind of written some songs together. But yeah, I mean, it took me a long time to realize, when someone asked me like, who are your biggest influences
Hmm.
as a researcher, as an anthropologist, as a writer, and it's a mix of singer-songwriters, bands,
Yeah.
novelists. I mean, it's a lot of things that aren't anthropological or even nonfiction writers.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, you got me thinking about those singers. I'm thinking of like, I don't know. I don't know, again, not know a lot about like, I'm thinking like Bob Dylan. I'm thinking
Yeah,
what Pete Seeger and shoot, Jim Croce. You know Jim Croce?
yeah, yeah, yeah. I
I was
mean,
always
all
a
I
big
mean,
fan of
all
him.
I mean,
Right?
all those guys. I mean, you don't have a lot of space in this
Hmm.
with these songs, and so if you can paint a, a detailed picture with not a lot of words, it's I find it to be really impressive. Um,
And maybe my
and
favorite of all time is Zach De La Rocha, Rage Against the Machine.
and that guy,
Ooh,
does it's not a lot of words, but I mean, it really, it cuts to the bone.
it really does. Really does. So I wonder about as we kind of transition into the book, and is it safe to say it was about 7 years of research? I mean, were you mostly embedded
It was
in?
like on and off,
Uh-huh.
if I was teaching, I was there in the summers. If, I had a sabbatical a
Mm,
couple of times in the middle of that, and so was able to spend, you know, 3 to 6 months at a time doing
okay.
this stuff, but like time in there and then leave and then come back. It was a pretty long and kind of drawn out, kind of process. And normally, like with my first book, I think the timeline was much shorter. I was like in the field for longer periods of extended time. With this one, it was
Hmm.
like because of family, because of work, I
Hmm.
was having to kind of come in and out because of COVID. I mean, there were a lot of
Hmm.
things that
Yeah.
that delayed it. But yeah, I tried to be in the field, as much as I could. And it was always really helpful to be able to go back to a place after spending a lot of time there and being able to clear my head and come back
Hmm.
and then and look at it with fresh eyes.
Yeah, it's just so impressive how the book is not about you, but you do insert yourself in places that make so much sense. They add to like some sort of juxtaposition or a connection that you have. I also love, so that's first person. I also love how when you're like transcribing the interviews, it's Jason.
Mm.
Somebody takes me, I'm like, who's Jason? Oh yeah, the
Yeah.
writer. So I'm just so impressed at how well you did that. The embedded part. You're just an observer in some ways, but you're also inserting your own. Like just a great mix of that. I wonder, and obviously any time that if the question is too personal, or whatever. I know you drop parts, some really personal things into the book, but I just wonder about that vertigo. Was it kind of like a vertigo at times, back and forth to like? It sounded like you were teaching in Mexico City, maybe, or at times.
I
No.
was living in Mexico City
For
and then
living.
yeah, traveling in and out from
Yeah.
there.
But just like the back and forth between, and you do write about it a few times, just you're like, oh, I'll be leaving in an hour and they'll
Yeah.
be on the train tracks in Chiapas. But just
Yeah.
about that vertigo, possibly, again, I don't want to put words in your mouth. Maybe that's that way to describe it.
Yeah, I mean it's really
Whiplash, that's maybe the term.
yeah, I mean it it's always the case, you spend all this time in this foreign environment that's often pretty extreme, and then I have to go back to my house. I have to go
Mm,
back to like normalcy. And I think
mm,
that's been kind of one of the weird things. Like, this book ended up being pretty personal about why I was there, how I was there, what was happening when I was there. And a lot of people have read this book and come to me and been like, holy shit, like
yeah.
who knew? And I worry partly I'm like so now you know how I really am, right? Like that I am a maniac, or like I like maybe I've confirmed some suspicions about what it is I'm up to when I'm elsewhere. Um but for me it's funny. I'm often way more comfortable in those kind of weird cultural contexts than I am on campus. I mean, the academy, it's like I'm an academic because it supports me to go and do these things that I want to do that have nothing to do with being on campus.
Mm,
I love teaching. I love students. I benefited greatly from both um, from elementary, middle school, and high school learning, and my teachers who I had, and in college as well. And so I love that aspect of my job. But like when I have to like go from like the train tracks to a faculty meeting, um, that's a really jarring kind of
yeah.
thing. And the book it's has some pretty kind of gnarly moments. And yeah, lately I've been like weird, like people who I kind of know who are like, oh, I read your book, and I'm like,
Mm.
fuck, like what do you think about me now?
Yeah.
But yeah, it was always hard. And I mean, and the hardest part is, I'm someone who's committed to, I'm committed to helping the world be a better place and to raising awareness about the brutality that the majority of our species experiences. And so I put myself in these places to try to write about it and try to understand it. But then I always just feel so guilty when I get to walk away from it, and
Yeah. Yeah.
like I get to go to New York and be in some fancy award ceremony. None of the
Mm.
people I write about get to be there.
Uh-huh.
Um, and so I carry a lot of that guilt with me. And yeah, it does definitely, the going back and forth is really can be really challenging.
I'm definitely gonna remember that quote. I mean, that's so true. You talk about like the majority of the world experiences or a huge, yeah, that's wow, that's very interesting. The epigraph is from, sorry, how do you pronounce it? Isbell? Jason Isbell?
Yep. Yep.
About kind of about choosing life. And pardon the pun, but I wonder why you chose that.
Um,
Are you living the life you chose? Are you living the life that chose you?
yeah. Isbell, he also begins my first book as well. I mean, and that partly is because when I was doing the research for both those projects, his music was constantly playing on the stereo, in my
Mm,
headphones, just everywhere. And anyone that's
mm,
been in the car with me for any amount of time has probably been exposed to Isabel in some way, shape, or form. And part of it is because I think the writing is so great,
mm,
and I think that he is the as far as I'm concerned, he's the greatest living songwriter right now.
mm.
Springsteen, Dylan have had their moment and still
Yeah,
continue to produce things I think
yeah.
that are interesting and great. But Isabel right now is kind of in his prime,
Wow.
and it really spoke to me a lot during the work. And that song, The Life You Chose, it's I love that line, like, are you living the life you chose or the life that chose you? Which kind of and I think that's a question that gets put into the people in the book, like, are they smugglers because they really want to be smugglers, or
Mm,
were they preordained by something to be kind of on this
sure,
track? And
sure.
how far will free will get you when the system is already rigged to put you into a particular track? And
Hmm.
so I like people to kind of think about those complexities of like structure versus agency. Like, how much free will do we actually have?
Mm,
And what happens when we start to think about, smugglers don't fall out of the sky.
mm.
They don't have, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. I mean, these are the products of long history and the result of all kinds of forces at work that are far beyond any one person's control.
Hmm. Have you ever read Things Fall Apart, Chinua Achebe?
Definitely. That's why there's a
Yeah.
chapter in the book, I think, called Things Fall Apart.
There is. It
Yeah.
took me a second. So I teach that. I've read it probably 40 times in my life. If you remember, the ending is from the point of view of the
Uh,
missionary.
it's great. I mean, the ending is like,
Unbelievable, right?
yeah, I
So
mean,
good.
yeah. I mean, I think the ending, it's funny, I was thinking about the ending yesterday, um, in, because I teach ethnographic writing, I teach sort of methods with students. And I
Hmm.
said, a lot of times these people who are writing about our society or modern society, they want things kind of wrapped up nicely. They want a nice answer to stuff. And
Hmm.
then I'm like, a lot of times it's just this very unsatisfying end. And
Yeah,
I love
yeah,
the end
yeah,
of
yeah,
that.
yeah.
The ending of that
Yes.
book is like, that person
Yes.
is reduced to a line that will show
Right.
up in some academic paper later, some journal,
Right.
some in this person's memoirs later, that completely fails to understand the complexities of the situation.
Exactly. I mean, Okonkwo is pretty much I mean, my students, I mean, pretty detestable character in so many ways, but it's just like, dang, like he worked and, illusion on illusion on illusion. Yeah, all good art. I think of like, in the end, Lincoln Park.
Yeah,
Does it really matter? What Nothing really matter. Like how he got, like you said, those three sentences in that
yeah,
incredibly racist title, something about the primitive tribe, something that he would have absolutely rebelled against.
yeah,
Right. So the reason I bring that up, is the book starts with Jose Roberto, whose name is incorrect in the article, right? His life is reduced to three sentences. Um, in Honduras, he dies, and it's an obituary or a story about his death, right? And that's how the book starts. So it's definitely a very jarring beginning. And a young person, which is always, more sad if that's possible, type of death. You early on, you get into the idea, the difference between smuggling versus trafficking. A lot of people know the coyote title, also called pasador and pollero. How would you talk about the difference between smuggling and trafficking, human smuggling, human trafficking?
trafficking happens against your will.
Hmm.
And someone sells you into slavery. They take you and they make you do things you don't want to do. They move you to places that you don't want to be, and you have no control over that. Smuggling, you are seeking someone out and you're trying to pay them for their services. Like, no one pays to get trafficked. People pay to get smuggled, but that smuggler might end up trafficking them and kind
Mm,
of double, betraying them, and so that
right.
happens, and so those things can intersect. But fundamentally, one you're paying for one as a service, the other one you're experiencing as a brutality that you
Hmm.
actively don't want to be involved
Mm,
with. But we conflate those terms all the time. Popular media does it, I mean, consistently, and so I really wanted people to think about smuggling as this is a service that people are providing.
mm,
And obviously, it's a highly exploitative system, but it is definitely a service industry.
hmm. I think the first person who comes up, I think is Flaco. I've, him or someone else. They talk about the idea of a guia, right? Guia means guide, and preferring that title more. So like you talk about, there's a lot of not semantics. I mean, the words do matter,
Yeah.
but obviously, if someone who is himself in that position, I want to know what they call it, how they see it. And you write about how these guys, the Gia, the smuggler, they can be violent, they can be murderers, they can be horrible people. They don't have to be. I mean, it sounds so simple, but I wonder about just writing to avoid generalization.
Yeah. I mean, people are complex. And I think that a lot of times the stories that we tell about communities of color don't allow for that complexity,
Mm.
right? Like if you write about migrants, you're supposed to write about the noble migrant, right?
Hmm.
You're supposed to write about like the
Mm.
person that you can kind of root for. You're not supposed to write about the bad migrant. You're not supposed to write about the kind of detestable person. You're not supposed to write about the person who's complicated, who you might love and hate, right? We don't make
Hmm.
space for that typically.
Mm.
Um, and I really think that we don't need any more stories about migration that just repeat these same kind of tired tropes.
Mm.
People are complicated. And yeah, I mean, you read the end of Things Fall Apart and it's a conflicted ending, right? You're like this person who you've been like watching brutalize others and struggle with like the impacts of colonialism and
Mm.
racism and who is trying to do good but just can't seemingly do it and does lots of bad things and they become sort of detestable and then they die and nobody, I think, at least no one that I know, reads the end of that book and is like, well, he got what he deserved, right? They
Mm.
read the end of it and they're like, fuck, like that's how life often is. And, this complicated set of feelings. And, I think we need more stories like that. And, for me, like smugglers, I knew people would come in the door if you put the word smuggling on the title because that's interesting and that's like you're
Mm.
expecting a kind of salacious
Sure.
sort of thing, but it's like you get them in and then you sneak in this other stuff into the sauce. So it's like, oh, actually, this is not just
Mm.
this simplistic narrative about how all smugglers are bad, but this is really trying to complicate this thing and show you a full range of people who,
Mm.
um, someone like Roberto or Santos are probably more kind of likable for
Mm.
for many people. Flaco less so, Kingston maybe even less so. But for me, these guys they're just living their lives and their lives are complicated.
Mm.
And I really wanted people to kind of see that the complexities of their experiences and you should walk away with more questions than answers and walk away
Yes.
feeling more. I mean, I had someone say to me that they're like, "Oh, this project makes me feel uncomfortable." I said, "Well, that's okay because it makes
Said
me
you
feel
did your
uncomfortable
job.
too." Yeah, I mean, that's all
Uh,
that's all we can hope for. I don't want you to feel good about it. There's
Mm.
nothing to feel good about, but I also don't want you to have some overly simplistic understanding of these things.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
I mean, I remember like my first book. There's I tell a story about this guy that I call Memo, who he gets drunk. He's like working on a farm up near Bakersfield, and he gets drunk on a Friday afternoon and decides he's going to take the tractor to the liquor store to go on a beer run. So he hops on this
Uh-oh.
tractor and he drives down the street. He's going like 4 miles an hour, drunk on this tractor. He's waving at all his
Uh,
friends and cars. He's acting like he's in some kind of a parade.
mm.
These cops start following him. I think there's a line of cop cars behind him who eventually pull him over. He gets arrested and then he gets deported. And he's telling me the story, and I include it in the book. And I had a woman, a student, a Latina, say to me in a Zoom with her class. She said, "Don't you think that this story of this guy getting drunk on stealing a tractor is just perpetuating the story of a drunken migrant?" And I said, "Well, there's a lot of drunken Americans who get DUIs and do other stupid shit, and
Hmm.
and they don't get deported and have their life almost end. I mean, this guy makes a mistake like many other people have made mistakes, a silly, stupid one, but
Hmm.
it's a life-changing kind of thing. And for him, he tells that story to me because it's important to understand how he got where he is and what had happened. Um, for me, it's an important story also. So you get a sense of who he is as an individual, why he's funny, how he tells it in this funny way, so that you can kind of start to see him as not the drunken migrant, but you see him as like this guy who got drunk, did a bunch of stupid stuff, can laugh about it later, but can talk about it in this more in-depth and complex way that gives you a sense of him as an individual. And,
Hmm.
I really want to write stories. I don't want to write stories about migrants. I don't want to write stories about the border. I want to write stories about people who happen to be migrants sometimes, who
Hmm.
happen to be crossing borders, but who are so much more than that at the end of the day.
It seems like a lot of your life experience with military family, like I said, living in different places, that aloneness at times, that solitude, really, you're naturally good with people putting people at ease. You write about that in the book that with some of the early conversations like Flacco gives, and you can see that there's a rapport. I wonder about maybe some ethical concerns. Well, you did talk about like, you're playing the long game as an anthropologist, right?
Yeah.
You're trying to form those bonds, those connections so that it pays off down the road. But also you're just a good human being and you want to make those connections. But I was wondering about any maybe ethical concerns. I mean, there you reference seeing a lot of violence, you reference hearing about a lot of violence, you reference of a lot of violence that, may happen that you hear about that involves these people that you know. They tell some really dark things that they've done. I wonder about that, whether it's just as an anthropologist in general, or as an academic. I don't know. Maybe both.
Yeah.